Okay, friends, the story begins and we dive into the Torah portion of Pekudie. This is the last Torah portion of the book of Exodus. And what we're going to hopefully walk away with at the end of this discussion is how to become more stable people. How do we become more stable in our relationship with God? How do we become more stable in our relationship with people? I think people crave stability in relationships. And I here's the thing with stability, guys. Stability, it's easy to be stable when life is stable. When circumstances go your way, it's easy for things to be stable. And it's, of course, I will have stability if that person changes. And if this changes and if this happens. Yeah, right. How do we develop internal stability despite our circumstances, even when circumstances seem to take us for a ride? Sometimes God seems to take us for a ride. Sometimes people seem to take us for a ride. And where do we develop that stability? We can derive lessons about this from the Mishkan, the tabernacle. The Torah portion of Pekudie goes through the entire, basically, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like this accounting. This is the whole portion is about this accounting of what took place in the construction of the Mishkan, what was used. And I'm going to read the first sentence of the Torah portion. I'll translate it from Hebrew to English because there's some interesting things that we need to unpack here. It says Elif Kude HaMishkan. These are the Pekudei HaMishkan, the countings of the Mishkan. Mishkan Ha'edut, the Mishkan, the tabernacle of testimony. Asher Pukad Api Moshe, which was counted according to Moses. Avodat Halavim, the service of the Levites. Beyad Isamar, in the hands of Itamar ben Aharon, the son of Aaron HaKohen, the Kohen. So let's. We have a few questions here we need to unpack to really get to this, to get to the bottom of this. Number one, why is there an accounting? If you read the Torah portion of Teruma, which was a couple of weeks ago, Hashem tells Moshe exactly how to construct the Mishkan, how to construct this home for God. If you look in last week's portion, Vayakel, Moshe instructs the Jewish people how to build this, how to build a Mishkan for God, how to build this sanctuary for God. And now we're going to recount what took place. It's like those speakers who say what they're going to say, then they say it, and then they say what they said. It's like, why are you doing that? Why all the repetition? What is the purpose of this recounting? If I may, to take this question a little bit further, we don't seem to be fans of counting in Judaism, usually. Usually in shul, we don't, you're looking for a minyan. You say, not one, not two. We don't count people. When Moshe came to take a census of the Jewish people, he didn't count the Jewish people. What did he do? He collected a half shekel coin from each person, counted the coins. We usually associate counting with the opposite of blessing, with curses. Usually counting is not a good thing. Our sages tell us that whatever's counted lacks blessing, because when you count, you flaunt. When you focus on flaunting your wealth and counting the money you have, you're exposing too much, and that creates ayin hara. When we're flaunting ourselves, how do people view us? Negatively. That's ayin hara, like the evil eye. That doesn't attract blessings. That attracts negativity. Usually counting is associated with negativity. That's number two. Number three, many commentaries do tell us the purpose of this counting. I think it's interesting to note that Rashi does not. Because Rashi is unique among the commentaries, because Rashi is considered to be the literal interpretation. Yet Rashi doesn't give any reason for this counting. If you look in some of the commentaries, they say that, you know what the reason for the counting was? it's quite a utilitarian purpose. But if you look in the Or HaChaim and many other commentaries, why is Moshe counting what took place in the construction of the tabernacle when we had just read about it? The Torah is telling us that Moshe didn't want to become accused. The rabbi fundraised all this money, and people might challenge his integrity. Where is that money going? What's it being used for? Is every penny being used for what you're saying? So Moses is transparent. Moses is demonstrating transparency to avoid negative perspective, to avoid cynics, to dodge the cynics or skeptics who are saying, Moshe, are you sure that's the value of the tabernacle? Is there any leftover funds that you're pocketing? God forbid, as if Moshe would actually do something like that. And why would people see that Moshe was doing anything like that? I don't know. And that's a whole discussion for another time. I think it's important to note that Rashi does not take that perspective. That is a perspective that many commentaries take. Rashi does not take that perspective. The reason for Rashi for the counting, no reason. But there's a lesson here. Rashi is one of the most fascinating commentaries. Let me digress for a moment. The reason why Rashi is a fascinating commentary is because he is the most literal interpretation. He wrote his interpretation so an adult and as well as someone as young as 5 years old can understand Torah properly. In other words, theoretically, we read the Torah and there's obviously a lot of ambiguity. And if you want to be clued in, you got to learn Talmud. You got to learn Midrash. And Talmud and Midrash are incredibly vast. Most people can't learn the entire Talmud, the entire Midrash, then learn the Torah, then apply everything they learned in the Midrash to the Torah. That is a crazy, crazy task. So Rashi extracted from Talmud, from Midrash, the most literal interpretations, the most simplistic interpretations. Not everything is, some things are homiletic, but Rashi is considered to be literal. And his interpretations are considered to be life messages and perspectives. And commentaries derive lessons both from what Rashi says and both from what Rashi does not say, which, by the way, that itself is a great lesson in life. You listen to what people are saying, listen to what they're not saying. Right? That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Rashi does not give an explanation for this counting. What do we see in the donations of the Mishkan? One thing that you see, and this actually connects to the fact that Moses felt the need to demonstrate integrity, what we see was incredibly generous Jewish people. Very generous. In fact, the Torah tells us in last week's Torah portion that they were giving so much that they had to be stopped. It's like, guys, enough. We can't even spend all this. We can't even use all this. It's just, at this point, it's just wasteful. You don't need to donate anymore. People were so generous. People were generous with their resources, financial resources and possessions. People were generous with their talent. They were incredibly generous in donating themselves, their hearts, their souls. Like we said, that even, the prime example of this was the women, the ladies, who had donated their talents, spinning the wool off the animals' backs without even having to remove the wool yet, which had reasons for it, but was considered to be a very difficult task. The Torah obviously feels that this is worth repeating. Jews have been generous. Jews have invested talent. Jews have invested their souls. And the Torah says, God says, I want to talk about this. And I want to talk about this in detail because this matters. This is especially so, by the way, because the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is an atonement for the sin of the golden calf. The very opening sentence in this week's Portia, the Elep Kude HaMishkan, this is the accounting of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, Mishkan HaEdut, the Mishkan of testimony. And Rashi says, why is this a Mishkan of testimony? What is it testifying? It's testifying that God forgave the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf. Because instead of using gold and silver and riches to invest in idolatry, to invest in things that make us feel good but are false and harmful and hurtful to our relationships, we invest in something that's going to facilitate God's presence in this world, that's going to create eternal meaning. And that's an incredible, incredible atonement. And the way we invested was generously. The way we invested was passionately. The way we invested was intellectually, because we've put our talents in it. And God says, I want to repeat that. I'll have a whole portion dedicated to discussing the things you've done. You know, when I meet couples, one of the things I do is get them to talk about the things they've done. But the things, not that things they've done that have brought them into counseling, the things they've done that they wouldn't have gone to counseling for if they have done more of that. Does that make sense? In other words, I'm not going to ask a question like, so why are you guys here? Tell me about the worst part of your life. I want to know, what would it look like if you never had felt the need to call me, theoretically? Like, how did you meet? What was it like before you felt the need to call me? And I want them to talk about that in incredible detail. Because when you talk about good things in incredible detail, you think about it, you ruminate, you become triggered, and you start realizing how much good there is. That doesn't mean that the bad isn't true. It doesn't mean we never sinned with the golden calf. But the good is also true. And maybe that good, maybe that positivity is actually worth living for, worth striving for, worth fighting for. And God is telling us in this message of the Torah, I want to count every detail in this Mishkan, because I want to repeat every detail that is emblematic of our investment in this relationship, of our investment in bringing God's presence into this world. I want to talk about it more and more and more. I don't want to talk about the sin of the golden calf as much as I want to talk about your investment in building a temple and building a home for God. I want to talk about that more. There's a whole portion dedicated to that. The sin of the golden calf definitely occupies space in Torah. The construction of the tabernacle, though, occupies a lot more space, several portions, and you have an entire portion here at the end, culminating the book of Exodus, which recounts everything in detail. Because when we ruminate about the good details in our life that talk about our investment, we start thinking that way. A while back, I was working with a couple, and it was a second meeting. And I said to them, we opened up the session with this, guys, what's been better since we have met? I don't mean to say, I understand that there's frustrations. I understand that all the problems didn't magically go away. Despite all of that, despite the frustration, despite the challenges, despite the difficulties and the pain and the hurt, and maybe even distrust, if you were to notice what's been better, what do you think you would come up with? So one party starts conveying. The other person says, nothing. So I said, how did you keep things from getting worse? You did something. And this person describes everything he did to invest in the relationship. And I started asking questions to pick apart the details, because I want to understand it's not just I want to understand what he had done. I want him to understand what he had done. Because I want him to think about the details and to understand how everything he's doing, the details in that relationship, is emblematic of his care, emblematic of his investment, similar to the Jewish people. Them building the tabernacle is in detail with investment is emblematic of their investment in this relationship. Going back to the tabernacle of testimony. That's what we call it, the Mishkan Ha'edut. And again, Rashi says, based on the Midrash, it was testimony that God had forgiven the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf. It's testimony that God's presence resides with us. There's a lot of things in Judaism that we do. Why is the tabernacle emblematic of the fact that God resides with us more than something like the tablets? I mean, the tablets didn't last, right? Maybe that means our relationship with God doesn't last. But there's other monumental events. The monumental event at Sinai, Moses is giving us the tablets. We receive the Torah. We carry that Torah with us. Yet the symbolism that God is with us is the tabernacle. So
Isn't
the commentary. Sorry?
Isn't it also because of commitment of the people?
Exactly.
And the effort that they put in to make it theirs. And
exactly. In other words, when God had offered us the Torah, it says in Parshas Yisro that the Jewish people stood at the foot of the mountain. But if you look at the Hebrew, that's a translation, at the foot of the mountain, and it's not a literal translation. If you translate it literally, it says they stood under the mountain. And Rashi translates it as, Rashi, again, as a liberal interpretation, tells us, okay, it says at the foot of the mountain, but what the Torah means, it says under the mountain, but what the Torah means is at the foot of the mountain. But the Talmud takes a less literal approach and says that God picked up this mountain, held it over our heads, and threatened us. Do you guys want to receive this Torah or not? And we're like, we'll do it. We'll do it. Commentaries have different explanations as to what that means. The Talmud is not necessarily being literal. And we know from our Talmud discussions earlier that sometimes when Talmud makes non-halachic statements, sometimes it's figurative. And some commentaries say that God seduced us with love. If you were to experience the truth of God and face God face to face, and he says, do you want to accept the Torah? Will you marry me? Sure. So we were forced into it. There's no symbolism of God residing with us because we didn't work for it, which is why it didn't last. The sin of the golden calf happened several weeks later, 40 days later. But the tabernacle was something we invested in. It was our investment. It's something we built. And because we built it, it's something we did. We invested in it. It's symbolic of God residing with us. When relationships start off as inspirational, it's not a bad thing, by the way. Inspiration is good. Infatuation, right? These aren't bad things. But are they sustainable? Is inspiration sustainable? Is feeling great because of an event sustainable? You can't live. It's hard to live life that way. You need that. You need inspiration. You need a Yom Kippur, where you walk out after Yom Kippur and you say the rabbi's speech was beautiful, the service was beautiful, it was inspiring, and I want to just embrace you. You need that inspiration. But is inspiration alone sustainable? No, you got to build a sukkah afterwards. After Yom Kippur, when you're on fire, you got to actually build something. And it might be outdoors, and it might be uncomfortable, and it might be hot, or it might be cold, but you're going to live there anyways. You're going to work on this together. You're going to build this relationship. I was listening to this marriage relationship expert. He says, stop. This is brilliant. He says, people say we should stay married for the kids. Don't do that. Work on your relationship. Got to actually build something. So we had inspiration at Mount Sinai. And in order to properly channel that so it's sustainable, we built something, the tabernacle. And we build that in our own lives as well. And when we build something like that, in a way God wants us to build it, and we ruminate how we had built that. We talk about how we had built it. That's symbolic and emblematic of God's presence resting with us. I want to take us to the next Rashi. Again, if you look back at the text, Pekudie HaMishkan, these are the accountings of the Mishkan. Mishkan HaEdut, the Mishkan of testimony. Why did you say that twice? These are the accountings of the Mishkan of testimony. Just say it once. This is the accountings of the Mishkan of testimony. Why the Mishkan of testimony? The sanctuary of testimony. It's like saying, hi guys, I'm Josh Zeberman. No, just say, hi, I'm Josh Zeberman. Right? This is the sanctuary of testimony. Why is it saying it twice? So what does Rashi say? It's symbolic of a future historical event. Two historical events that are unfortunate. It's symbolic of the destruction of the two temples, the two permanent homes for God in Jerusalem because of our sins. This is what Rashi says. And it's like we have this whole portion ruminating, talking about how beautiful the investment of the Jewish people are. And it's like, Rashi, why would you bring that up now? Don't talk about that now. It's like we're on this date with God, ruminating about the great times we had. It's like, why are you mentioning that now? Why are you mentioning, even though it's a future event, didn't even happen yet, but why are you mentioning our deficiencies? It's not relevant now. We're trying to talk about the investment that we have, what we're building. That's symbolic of God forgiving us. That's symbolic of God being with us no matter the circumstance, because we've built this. We didn't just rely on inspiration. And Rashi says, it says Mishkan twice because it's symbolic of the destructions that are to take place. Doesn't that seem unfair to talk about this now and a little bit out of place? And just Rashi is telling us something incredible about the stability of relationships. The temples were destroyed physically. The physical structure was destroyed. The first by the Babylonians, the second by the Romans, the third to be rebuilt in the coming of Mashiach. We still go to the ground zero, to the Western Wall. We still go there because the space is holy. The holiness remains. The structure is gone. And Rashi's telling us we've built a relationship. And because we built a relationship, and that relationship that we had built has a foundation, a spiritual foundation, even though the physical structure may not last in the future, the relationship is still going to be there. The connection is still going to be there. So Rashi's telling us, it says Mishkan twice, sanctuary twice, because it's alluding to the future destructions. Why talk about destruction? Rashi's not talking about destruction. He's talking about stability in spite of destruction. Because there's going to be even though there's going to be destruction in the future, even though the first temple is only going to last 410 years, even though the second temple is going to last only 420 years, its identity as this is the space where God will connect with us is eternal. The core of the relationship is eternal. And we have that in our relationships where we feel like there's things about the relationship that may not be working, but fundamentally at its core, there's something to go back to. And because at its core, there's something to go back to, it's something worth fighting and working on because it's there all along. Again, this is why I ask couples, the first thing is not what is the problem, but how did you meet? Let's go back to where this all started. Rashi is not saying, don't get too excited about the inspiration. It ain't going to last. There's going to be two destructions. Rashi's saying, in spite of those destructions, this is still emblematic and symbolic of God resting with us, his divine presence resting with us. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the Rambam refers to the temple as the Beit Olamim, which means the eternal home for God. It's an eternal home for God. It's been destroyed. Why is it an eternal home? Because sometimes the outer structure gets destroyed, but the core, the spiritual identity is still there. I'll share with you something fascinating. You're going to like this. It's very much related. Yosef, let's go back to the story of Yosef and his brothers fighting. They're jealous of him. They abduct him, throw him in the pit. They end up selling him. They wanted to kill him, but they end up selling him, right? And he ends up going to Egypt, becoming the viceroy of Egypt. But what did they tell his father? What did they tell Yaakov? Yosef has been devoured. Yosef is gone. And what does Jacob do? What does Yaakov do? He mourns. He mourns, but refuses to become consoled. Usually when people mourn, this might be a blessing and a curse, but time heals. Not that people move on, but time does heal. Time does have this funny way of making unfortunate atrocities and realities a little bit more bearable. But for some reason, time wasn't healing him. And Rashi says, time heals when something bad actually happened. When you think something bad has happened, but it didn't actually happen, time won't heal. You can't mourn something that didn't happen. So commentaries say, well, how long have we been mourning the destruction of the temple? Our building was destroyed 2,000 years ago. Why isn't time healing us? You can't mourn something that never really happened. It did happen. The structure got destroyed, but its spiritual core is still there. Couples often are frustrated over the relationships and are holding on tight. Why? Because they know there's something there worth fighting, which is why they're frustrated. Otherwise, time would heal. They'd grow apathetic and they'd just move on. A similar parallel is the concept of teshuvah. Right, one level of teshuvah, which we call forgiveness or repentance or whatever you want, right, returning to God. One level of teshuvah is forgive me, but another level of teshuvah is returning. It's going back to that space where problems aren't present, where problems don't exist. And if we could just have a conversation from that space, it's a very different conversation. When I work with couples, it's couples are fighting. It could get heated. But if we could take a moment and get to this space where I'm talking about how they met or talking about the version of each other that they do like, the conversation is very different. Right? So that's essentially the same idea to your point, that going to a different space, then having conversations is much healthier. So we could talk about the destruction, the building is gone. But we could also talk about is despite the building gone, there's still something here. And talking from that space is incredibly healing, incredibly empowering. Similar to the para aduma, to the service of the red heifer.
So when you get to that space, then you build from that space onwards, and then do you ignore the rest, or do you know that it exists?
You got to rebuild.
Or do you
got to rebuild.
So the destruction of the temple happened, and you got to rebuild from that beautiful core.
Their temple is going to be beautiful. It's going to be bigger. It's going to be holier. It's going to be something we've been working on for so long. It's going to be something that had been worth investing in. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.